Welcome back. Among the many economic headaches for the government, of course, there's debt. So Finance Minister Tito Mboweni saying today that government has to act now to avoid a sovereign debt crisis. He said this is why we simply could not spend our way out of the COVID-19 crisis. Overall, spending is going up. Less tax revenue is coming in, which is a big problem. Today, Mboweni said that revenue has been revised down by 8.7 billion rand for the current financial year. Let's chat now to SARS Commissioner Edward Kieswetter. Mr. Kieswetter, thank you for joining us. So when COVID came, you knew, I think we spoke at the time, that there would be this gap, obviously, between the taxes expected at the beginning of the year and the money coming in ultimately. Is that gap getting bigger and bigger? Where do we stand?
Well, the gap, Francis, thank you, good evening. The gap clearly is significantly influenced by what happens in the economy. And we know that since the minister announced the initial estimate in February, from that point to now, our view of what would happen in the economy has changed by almost 15%, nominally from just over 4% to now a projection of around about minus 7.8%. And so that clearly means a lower economic activities and therefore lower collection of taxes. But the real concern is that there has also been a contraction of the number of jobs. We've seen an increase in the applications for directives for retrenchment, almost doubling. We have seen 2.2 million job losses in the second quarter reported. In companies, we have seen an increase in the number of liquidation applications and business rescue. So the longer term concern is the loss of revenue capacity because if there are no businesses, no jobs, tax revenue is impacted by that.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the issue, which links us back to the allocation of resources within government so that, as the minister indicated today, more must be spent on investment, whilst we understand there are social grants and other safety nets that must, of necessity, be spent. We also have to make sure that we are more efficient in the allocation of revenue, of expenses in other areas of government, so that, in fact, we can get the return on that expenditure. Ultimately, our economy has to grow. Our economic capacity has to increase, and that is the longer-term implication that will have a positive impact on tax revenue. But there is also...
So if I can interject, some of the spending was about this creating a condition for investment, in investments expenditure. But a controversial issue is SAA, 10.5 billion rand. Civil groups are raising concern about that. Is that a hard sell to some South Africans who we know are already reluctant to even pay their taxes?
I think it is a tough sell. The minister was clear that government has approached this as an obligation, and it is specifically money is allocated to implement the business rescue plan. And so from that perspective, the minister is almost saying that government considers that it is not a choice, but rather a decision that it wants to exercise to rescue, to implement the proposal by the rescue practitioners. But I think overall, South Africans are quite right to demand that state-owned enterprises are well governed, well managed, and in fact, well-managed state-owned enterprises will not be a drain on state resources, but they will in fact produce good returns, cover their own expenses, and in fact yield a dividend to government, which can, over the medium term, respond to the additional requirement for funding. And that's really where we have to focus our efforts. How do we run these state-owned enterprises more efficiently so that it does not become a burden on the fiscus?
Mr. Kieswetter, in this medium-term budget policy statement, the Finance Minister doesn't usually talk about specific tax proposals. That comes in February. But what are we looking at, given the gap that we were talking about? There's been some talk of a wealth tax. Is that on its way?
Well, government hasn't spoken about any specific tax proposals, and you're quite right. The medium-term budget policy statement is not really about tax rates. The minister did, however, indicate to ensure the fiscal framework remains within the levels that he is planning. We would have to find an additional 40 billion of taxes. But the minister will clearly make more announcements in that regard in the February budget statement. So it's not really helpful to speculate about where that would come. What we can say to you is we know that compliance levels in South Africa has declined progressively over a number of years. We know that the illicit economy is thriving, and therefore we are also under-collecting taxes in that regard. So simply by focusing on the efficiency of revenue collections, we believe that a significant contribution over the medium term should come from a more effective and capable SARS and a higher and a tax payer universe that is significantly more compliant than where it currently is.
We always say, though, that tax base, that tax universe is pretty small, and some analysis has been going around about the poor, that sector, that segment growing in South Africa. You've spoken about job losses, retrenchments, people losing their jobs, but when you come to the very wealthy, that shrinking. Are you concerned about the level of wealth that has left South Africa?
Of course one is concerned, but let me first correct you. The tax base in South Africa is 59 million people, because everybody that consumes pays VAT on goods that they purchase at points of sale. They pay excise duties on so-called sin taxes. So every single South African contributes toward the fiscus. Where you are correct is that the employment base is significantly smaller, and therefore growing the employment base is an important part of expanding the tax base. And then in terms of corporates, sadly, we have to call it for what it is. We still see significant and aggressive planning by corporates to erode the tax base through transfer pricing abuse, by base erosion practices, getting money offshore, in ways that cannot be lawful, and therefore we will be focusing on that in a focused manner. And then there are also companies who still defraud the fiscus by overstating value of goods exported so that they can defraud the fiscus on export VAT, and also trade mispricing and underdeclaration of goods on the import. So I think ultimately this is a South African problem. If we do not pay our level of taxes that we should pay in terms of the statutory rates, then government has to consider other forms of addressing this. And therefore, by being more compliant, we actually take the pressure off the minister to increase tax rates.
Yeah. All right, looking at plugging the leaks, and we know you're also looking at PPE tenders. Hopefully we can chat to you soon about that. Thank you very much for your time tonight, SARS Commissioner Edward Kieswetter.